Hello everyone and God bless you. Welcome to the amazing Bible story of the feeding of the 5,000, told in a way to help you drift off into peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I thought it would be a fun idea if you could leave a comment below to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also remember to like the video and subscribe if you want to hear more like this. Okay, let's get comfy, relaxed, and let's begin. Chapter 1: Journey to the Hills. It was a warm and sunny day by the Sea of Galilee, where the rolling hills touched the clear blue sky. Jesus and his disciples walked together, their sandals crunching softly on the sandy path. They had been traveling for days, sharing the message of God's love in towns and villages, healing the sick and comforting those who were weary. Now, they were looking for a quiet place, a peaceful spot away from the crowds where they could rest and reflect. The air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers that dotted the hillside, and the sound of birds singing their cheerful tunes. The disciples breathed in the fresh air, relieved to have a moment to slow down. Peter, always the first to speak, turned to Jesus with a grin. "We've walked far today, teacher. This looks like the perfect place to take a break," he said, pointing to a shady spot under a group of tall, leafy trees. Jesus nodded, his eyes full of kindness. "Yes, let's rest here," he agreed, sitting down on the soft grass. The disciples joined him, laying down their bags and stretching out, grateful for a moment of quiet. It felt like the perfect place, calm, serene, and away from the busyness of the villages they had left behind. They could hear the gentle lapping of the waves from the nearby sea, a soothing melody that seemed to wash away the weariness of their journey. As they settled, Jesus looked out over the peaceful landscape. He could see the sparkling waters of the Sea of Galilee stretching out like a vast mirror, reflecting the sunlight. Little fishing boats bobbed on the waves in the distance, their sails fluttering in the breeze. It was a beautiful sight, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed down. The disciples smiled at each other, sharing a rare moment of stillness. James leaned back, resting his head on his hands. "It's good to be here," he said softly, closing his eyes. "We've been so busy these last few days. It's nice to just sit and listen to the wind for a while." John nodded in agreement, gazing up at the sky. "And look at the clouds," he said with a peaceful smile. "They're drifting by so slowly, like they're resting too." Jesus watched his friends with a gentle smile. He understood their need for rest, but he also knew something that they did not yet realize. Even here, in this seemingly quiet place, people would soon come. He could sense the stirrings of hope and curiosity, like a breeze picking up before a storm. The news of their arrival had already begun to spread, carried by those who had witnessed his miracles and heard his teachings. But for now, Jesus didn't say anything about what was coming. He simply let his disciples enjoy the moment, the feeling of soft grass beneath them and the warm sun on their faces. He knew they needed this time, a brief pause in the midst of their journey. He watched the waves roll gently onto the shore, a reminder of God's endless love and the rhythm of life. "Look at how peaceful it is," Matthew remarked, glancing over the sea. "It's hard to believe how many people have been seeking you, Jesus, all across the land." Jesus nodded thoughtfully, looking out toward the horizon where the hills met the sky. "Yes," he said quietly, "but even in the stillness, God is at work. People are searching for hope, for answers, and they will come when they know hope is near." The disciples fell silent, pondering his words. They knew that wherever Jesus went, people followed. His words brought comfort, and his touch brought healing. Even in places as remote as this, it seemed people would find their way to him. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The disciples felt a deep sense of calm, as if they were being wrapped in a blanket of peace. They were content, resting in the company of their teacher, unaware of how quickly the quiet would change. But Jesus knew. He could feel the stirring in his spirit, the soft pull of anticipation, like the first ripples before a wave swells. Soon, the peaceful hillside would be filled with the sounds of voices, laughter, and footsteps. But for now, it was just them, Jesus and his closest followers, enjoying a rare moment of stillness before the next part of their journey would unfold. With a final look over the hills, Jesus took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment of silent prayer. He knew that the people would come with their needs, their hopes, and their burdens. He was ready for them, as he always was, filled with love and compassion. And so, the disciples lay back, feeling the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze on their faces. They had no idea what was coming next, but they trusted Jesus completely. Little did they know that this quiet moment was just the calm before a miraculous event, one that would leave them all in awe and remind them of the incredible power of faith and God's provision. Chapter 2: The crowd begins to gather. The gentle hills and cool breeze seemed like the perfect place for a quiet afternoon. Jesus and his disciples had settled into the soft grass, enjoying the calm moment after days of traveling and teaching. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm light over the Sea of Galilee, making it glimmer like 1,000 tiny stars on the water's surface. The disciples felt a sense of relief. They finally had time to rest and reflect with Jesus, far from the noise of the bustling towns. But even as they relaxed, something began to stir beyond the hills. It started with a few families from a nearby village who had heard whispers that Jesus was close by. News of his teachings and miracles had spread like wildfire across the region. The stories people told about him were nothing short of amazing. The blind could see, the sick were healed, and those who felt lost and broken found hope in his words. So when they heard that Jesus was nearby, they didn't hesitate. Mothers quickly gathered their children, and fathers called out to neighbors, eager to set out together. From all directions, people began to walk toward the hillside. They came with hurried steps, yet their faces held a look of anticipation, as if they were about to meet a long-lost friend. Some carried babies wrapped snugly in cloth, while older children ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the fields. Grandparents leaned on walking sticks, smiling as they followed, determined not to miss this chance. It was as if an invisible thread of hope pulled them all toward one place, toward Jesus. The disciples, still lounging on the grass, noticed the small figures appearing on the horizon, like tiny dots growing bigger as they moved closer. At first, it was just a handful of people, but then it became dozens, and before long, it was clear that hundreds were making their way up the hillside. James squinted into the distance, a puzzled look crossing his face. "Look at that," he said, nudging John. "Do you see all those people coming?" John nodded, standing up to get a better view. "It looks like the whole village is on its way," he replied, both amazed and concerned. "I thought we were coming here to rest." Peter chuckled and shook his head. "It seems rest isn't part of our day after all," he said, smiling. "But look at them, they're so eager. It's like they can't wait to see Jesus." The disciples exchanged looks of surprise and a bit of worry. This wasn't the small crowd they had expected. This was a gathering that grew with every passing moment. Yet despite their concerns, there was something beautiful about it, too. A shared excitement, a collective hope that seemed to fill the air like the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Jesus, watching the scene unfold, wasn't worried at all. He saw the people coming, saw the joy in their eyes, and his heart was filled with compassion. He knew they were seeking more than just stories or miracles. They were searching for comfort, for a sign that God was with them in their struggles. He stood up slowly, brushing the grass from his robe, and turned to the disciples with a peaceful smile. "Let them come," he said simply. "These are the ones who need to hear the message of God's love today." The disciples nodded, understanding what he meant. They may have been tired, but they knew that Jesus' mission was about more than rest. It was about reaching out to those in need, offering hope to the weary, and sharing the light of God's kingdom. So they stepped forward, ready to help however they could. As the crowd drew nearer, the sounds of their voices filled the air. People greeted one another, some waving to friends they hadn't seen in weeks. There was a sense of community here, as if everyone had come together for a shared purpose. A young girl with bright eyes tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing toward Jesus with excitement. "Is that him?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, that's Jesus," her mother replied softly, her own eyes shining. We're going to listen to him teach. The people found places to sit on the hillside, spreading out blankets and settling down wherever they could. It was a colorful scene. Children with sun-kissed cheeks, elders with wise faces, and everyone in between, all gathered together in this natural amphitheater. The sea stretched out behind them, a peaceful backdrop to the anticipation that buzzed through the crowd like the hum of bees in a spring meadow. The disciples moved through the crowd, greeting people warmly, helping them find spots to sit, and sharing small smiles with those who looked nervous or unsure. It was a simple gesture, but it made the strangers feel welcomed, as if they had been invited to a great family gathering. Soon, the entire hillside was filled with people. It was astonishing how quickly the word had spread, how so many had dropped everything just to be here. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a soft light over the faces turned eagerly toward Jesus. It was as if time had slowed down, and in this moment, the worries of daily life faded away, replaced by a sense of calm expectancy. Chapter 3: A Moment of Teaching and Healing. The crowd settled in, a sea of faces filled with hope and curiosity, looking toward Jesus. The once quiet hillside was now alive with a gentle hum of excitement. As families gathered on the grass, friends greeted one another, and children played nearby, their laughter floating through the air like music. People had walked for miles, drawn by stories of miracles and words of wisdom that spread like wildfire from village to village. They had heard of how Jesus had touched the sick, comforted the sorrowful, and spoke of a kingdom unlike any they had ever imagined. Jesus stood before them, his presence calm and welcoming. He looked out at the crowd with eyes full of love, seeing not just a gathering of people, but individuals, each with their own stories, their own needs, and their own silent prayers. He could see the weariness on some faces, the curiosity on others, and the flicker of hope in the eyes of many. Without a word, he gestured for everyone to sit, and a hush fell over the hillside as they obeyed, eager to listen. He began to speak, his voice gentle yet filled with authority, like a soothing breeze that carried his words across the crowd. He spoke about love, forgiveness, and the importance of faith. He talked about God's kingdom, a place where the last would be first, where the poor would be blessed, and where the meek would inherit the earth. As he spoke, it was as if time stood still. The sun shone down warmly, casting a golden glow on the crowd, and the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. Jesus' words were simple yet profound. He spoke of a shepherd who searches for his lost sheep, never giving up until it is found. He talked about the mustard seed, the tiniest of all seeds, which grows into a large tree, providing shelter for birds. Even the smallest act of faith, Jesus said with a kind smile, can grow into something great in the eyes of God. The people listened intently, their hearts moved by his words. They had never heard anyone speak like this before. With such compassion, understanding, and wisdom, the mothers held their children close, whispering the teachings into their little ears, and the fathers nodded thoughtfully, feeling the truth of Jesus' words settle deep within their hearts. Even the children, usually restless and fidgety, sat quietly, their wide eyes fixed on the man who spoke of a love so vast and deep, it was hard to imagine. But Jesus didn't just speak. He moved among the people, offering more than just words. He reached out to those who were sick, touching them with a tenderness that brought immediate comfort. An older woman, bent over with pain, felt his hand on her shoulder, and in an instant, the ache she had carried for years melted away. Her face lit up with surprise and joy, tears of gratitude streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Nearby, a young boy who had struggled to walk since birth was brought to Jesus by his father. The father's eyes were filled with worry, yet also a glimmer of hope. Jesus knelt down beside the child, looking him in the eyes with a warm smile. He gently placed his hand on the boy's leg, and the crowd watched in silent anticipation. In moments, the boy's legs straightened, and he stood up on his own for the first time. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by soft murmurs of amazement and praise. The father hugged his son tightly, tears of joy streaming down his face. whispering prayers of thanks. Wherever Jesus went, he brought healing, comfort, and peace. He didn't turn anyone away, whether they were young or old, rich or poor, healthy or sick. His love was for everyone, and it flowed out of him like a river, refreshing all who came near. Those who were once in pain now stood tall. Those who were burdened found relief, and those who felt lost found a sense of direction. As the morning turned into afternoon, the crowd grew even larger. More people arrived, drawn by the whispers of miracles happening on the hillside. They came with their families, friends, and neighbors, all seeking a glimpse of the one who seemed to carry God's own light within him. The disciples, standing off to the side, watched in awe. They had seen Jesus heal before, but every time felt like the first time. A new revelation of his compassion and power. "Look at the people," John whispered to Peter. "They're so full of hope. It's like they know, deep in their hearts, that they've found what they've been searching for." Peter nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and amazement. "It's more than that," he replied softly. "They feel his love. It's as if they can finally breathe again." Jesus continued teaching, speaking of the Father's love, of forgiveness and mercy. He told stories that painted pictures in their minds, stories of seeds and trees, of lost coins found, and of celebrations in heaven for every sinner who repents. The people hung on every word, their hearts touched and uplifted. As the day went on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a bright, warm light over the hillside. The crowd was captivated, losing track of time as they soaked in the words and presence of Jesus. They had come with heavy hearts, burdens they couldn't carry on their own. But in this moment, as they sat in the grass, listening to the teacher, they felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Finally, Jesus paused, looking out over the crowd with a serene smile. He could see that they were tired, but they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay, to soak up every bit of this love and wisdom that he shared so freely. He gave them a reassuring nod, acknowledging their silent desire to remain with him a little longer. And so, the crowd stayed, sitting together in peaceful anticipation. They had come seeking something, healing, comfort, hope, and they had found it, in abundance, in the words and touch of Jesus. Little did they know, the day was far from over, and a greater miracle still awaited them. As the sun dipped slightly in the sky, the disciples exchanged glances, sensing a new challenge on the horizon. But for now, the people felt a deep sense of calm, knowing they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Someone who saw their needs, cared for their wounds, and loved them beyond measure. Chapter 4. The day wanes and a miracle unfolds. The sun, which had been a golden lantern in the sky all day, now began its descent. The sky softened into hues of pink and orange, casting a serene glow over the vast hillside. The once lively chatter of the crowd was beginning to quieten as the long day took its toll. People who had eagerly gathered from far and wide, following the stories of Jesus' miracles and teachings, were now settling into the grass, their energy waning but their spirits still lifted by his presence. Families sat close together, children resting their heads in their parents' laps. The breeze was gentle, carrying with it a whisper of the evening's coolness. Yet, as peaceful as the scene appeared, there was a growing restlessness among the people. Mothers exchanged glances, noticing their little ones rubbing their stomachs, and fathers frowned, realizing they had brought nothing to eat for such a long day. The disciples, who had initially been caught up in the joy of the gathering, were now becoming aware of the need around them. Peter scanned the crowd and his brow furrowed with concern. He stepped closer to Jesus, who was still surrounded by people seeking comfort and healing. "Master," Peter began, lowering his voice so as not to alarm anyone. "It's getting late, and the people haven't eaten. We should send them away to the nearby villages so they can buy something to eat before night falls." Jesus paused, his eyes filled with a deep compassion as he looked out at the crowd. He saw the weariness in their faces, the hunger that they tried to ignore, all for the chance to remain close to him a little longer. He turned back to Peter and the other disciples who had gathered around, their expressions mirroring Peter's concern. But instead of agreeing to send the people away, Jesus spoke calmly, his voice gentle yet firm. "They don't need to go away," he said, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You give them something to eat." The disciples exchanged bewildered looks. "But Lord," Andrew said, glancing nervously at the vast sea of people spread across the hillside, "we don't have enough food. Even if we spent all the money we have, it wouldn't be enough for everyone to have even a small bite." As they spoke, a young boy who had been standing nearby stepped forward. He had been watching the disciples, clutching a small cloth bundle in his hands. His face was shy but determined, and he looked up at Andrew with wide, hopeful eyes. "I have this," the boy said, holding out his bundle. Inside were 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish, barely enough for one family, let alone thousands. Andrew knelt down, his heart touched by the boy's simple gesture. He took the bundle carefully, smiling at the boy with gratitude. "Thank you," Andrew said softly. He then turned and carried the bundle over to Jesus. "There is a boy here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish," Andrew explained. "But what is this small amount for so many people?" Jesus looked at the humble offering, his face filled with gentle kindness. He took the bread and fish from Andrew, holding them in his hands as if they were the most precious gift. The disciples watched in silence, feeling a quiet anticipation as Jesus held the small meal up to the sky. The sun was dipping lower now, casting a golden halo around him as he stood there, giving thanks. He closed his eyes briefly and spoke a prayer of blessing, his words filled with gratitude. "Father, thank you for this food. Thank you for your endless provision. May it be used to feed all who are here today." His voice was calm and sure, a stark contrast to the disciples who still could not understand how this meager offering could make a difference. Then, without hesitation, Jesus began to break the loaves into pieces, placing them into the baskets the disciples held. He did the same with the fish, tearing them gently, as though every fragment was a cherished gift. The disciples watched, their eyes wide as the bread and fish seemed to multiply in his hands. The baskets filled and filled, more than they could have imagined, spilling over with food that moments before had been impossibly small. Jesus handed the first basket to Peter. "Go, give this to the people," he said. Peter, still stunned, nodded and carried the basket to the nearest group. He handed out the bread and fish, expecting it to run out quickly. But each time he reached in, there was more. Another piece of bread, another slice of fish. He glanced back at Jesus in awe, realizing that a miracle was unfolding right before his eyes. The other disciples, seeing this, began distributing the food as well. They moved among the people, basket after basket, and each time the bread and fish seemed to replenish itself. The crowd, who had initially looked on with curiosity, now burst into smiles and laughter as they received their share. Parents fed their children, friends broke bread together, and strangers shared stories as they ate, marveling at the abundance before them. It was a feast unlike any they had ever known, not because of the richness of the food, but because of the way it had come to them. The crowd had arrived hungry, their stomachs empty, but now they were filled not only with food, but with a deep sense of wonder and gratitude. They whispered among themselves, realizing that this was no ordinary meal. It was a sign of God's love and care, a tangible reminder that even the smallest offering could be transformed when placed in Jesus' hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft twilight over the hillside, the disciples continued to serve. They moved through the crowd with joy, watching the faces of the people light up as they received their share. It seemed as though everyone had more than enough. In fact, when the meal was over and the crowd leaned back, satisfied and full, there were still baskets filled with leftover bread. Jesus called the disciples to him, and together they gathered the remaining food. 12 baskets in total, one for each disciple, a powerful reminder of God's abundant provision. The disciples looked at one another, amazed. They had started with so little, and yet here they were, standing with baskets overflowing with food. The people began to realize the magnitude of the miracle they had just witnessed. There were quiet murmurs of awe and words of gratitude whispered to one another. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, they had heard his words of wisdom, but this was something they could all share in, something that had touched each and every one of them personally. The children, once tired and hungry, were now playing and laughing, their bellies full and their spirits light. Jesus stood among the crowd, his face serene, watching them with a look of deep contentment. He had not just fed their bodies, but had given them a taste of God's kingdom, where there is always enough, where love and generosity multiply, and where everyone is invited to share in the blessing. The disciples gathered close to Jesus, their hearts full. They had doubted, they had worried, but now they understood a little more of the vast, immeasurable love of God that Jesus had shown them today. As the crowd began to settle down, preparing to rest under the twilight sky, the hillside was filled with a profound sense of peace and unity. In that quiet moment, as the stars began to peek through the blanket of night, the people knew they had witnessed a miracle that started with the faith of a small boy and ended with a multitude being fed, both in body and in spirit. Chapter 5. The 12 Baskets of Leftovers and Whispers of Wonder. As the meal came to an end, the crowd slowly settled, reclining on the soft grass. The gentle murmur of satisfied voices filled the air, blending with the distant song of birds making their way home. Families sat together, smiling as they shared the last crumbs of bread, children playfully chasing one another while the parents rested, relieved and content. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in twilight shades of blue and purple, a peaceful end to what had been a truly remarkable day. Jesus stood quietly, watching the scene before him with a look of deep satisfaction. He knew that this day had not only filled the people's stomachs, but had also filled their hearts. He turned to his disciples, who had gathered nearby, each holding a large, empty basket. "Go now," Jesus said gently, his voice calm and steady. "Collect the leftovers, so that nothing is wasted." The disciples, still in awe of what they had witnessed, nodded and spread out among the people, carrying their baskets. They expected to gather just a small handful of scraps, but as they walked, they found more and more. Here, a family handed over a piece of bread they hadn't finished. There, a child shyly offered a part of his fish. Everywhere they went, the disciples discovered food left behind, more than they could have imagined. The miracle wasn't just in the feeding, but in the overwhelming abundance that remained. Peter, carrying his basket, looked down in disbelief as it filled quickly with fresh, fragrant bread. He exchanged a look with John, who was experiencing the same thing. "How can this be?" Peter whispered, his voice tinged with wonder. "We started with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. And now, look!" John's face broke into a wide smile, shaking his head as if to say he couldn't explain it either. Matthew's basket was overflowing, too. He carefully balanced it, glancing back at Jesus, who stood watching from a distance, his serene smile reflecting the joy he saw among the crowd. This, Matthew thought to himself, is more than a miracle of food. It's a miracle of love, a glimpse into the endless generosity of God. One by one, the disciples returned to Jesus, carrying their baskets. The people around them watched in silence, their eyes wide as they realized what was happening. 12 full baskets, one for each disciple, perfectly symbolizing the complete provision of God. It wasn't just enough. It was more than enough. The crowd had been fed abundantly, and yet there was still so much left over. It was as though the very hands of God had multiplied the meal beyond all expectation. A clear message that in God's kingdom, there is always enough. Jesus took a step forward, his gaze moving slowly across the faces in the crowd. He saw their awe, their wonder, and most of all, their gratitude. The people began whispering to one another, unable to contain their amazement any longer. "Did you see what happened?" A man said quietly to his wife. "He took just a handful of food, and now look. Everyone has eaten, and there's still so much left." His wife nodded, clutching her child close. "It's a miracle," she whispered back, her voice filled with reverence. "This man, he must be the one we've been waiting for. The stories we've heard are true. He heals, he teaches, and now he feeds thousands with barely anything. God is truly with him. Nearby, an elderly woman held her granddaughter's hand, tears welling in her eyes as she spoke softly. "This reminds me of the stories my grandmother told me when I was a little girl," she said. "Stories of God providing manna from heaven for our ancestors in the desert. We've seen the same today. God providing for us, right here through Jesus." Children huddled together, chattering excitedly. "Did you see the bread just appear?" one boy exclaimed. "It was like magic, but I think it was even better because it came from God." His friend nodded eagerly, holding up a leftover piece of bread as if it were a treasure. "I'm going to keep this," he declared. "I want to remember today forever." The disciples, overhearing the crowd's murmurs, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had doubted at first. They had been concerned about how the people would be fed. But now they understood a little more about who Jesus truly was. He wasn't just a teacher or a healer. He was the embodiment of God's love and provision. The 12 baskets they carried were more than just physical evidence of the miracle. They were symbols of a truth they were still beginning to grasp. With Jesus, there was no scarcity, only abundance. James, holding his basket, turned to Thomas, who was standing nearby, looking down at the bread as if he couldn't quite believe it. "You see, Thomas?" James said with a gentle smile. "This is what faith looks like. It's trusting that even when we can't see how, God will provide." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I see it now," he admitted. "I didn't understand before, but now I do. This isn't just about bread and fish. It's about trusting in God's power, even when it seems impossible." Jesus, sensing the shift in the hearts of his disciples and the crowd, allowed himself a small smile. He had taught them without speaking a word, simply by showing them the boundless love of God in action. He knew that the lesson of the day would stay with them far longer than any sermon could. As the last rays of sunlight faded away, the hillside was illuminated only by the soft light of the moon. The people began to gather their belongings, still speaking in hushed, reverent tones about what they had witnessed. Some embraced their loved ones, others knelt quietly, offering prayers of thanks. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of shared experience, a moment of connection not just with one another, but with something far greater. Mothers and fathers held their children close, whispering stories of the day, their voices filled with awe. "We were part of a miracle," they said, tucking the memory away like a precious gem to be passed down through generations. "We were there when Jesus fed thousands with just a small boy's lunch." And as they slowly made their way home, the whispers of wonder and gratitude filled the night air, mingling with the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves. It was as if the earth itself had joined in the quiet song of thanksgiving. The people knew that they had witnessed something divine, a glimpse of heaven on earth, a reminder that in the hands of Jesus, the simplest gifts could become the source of the greatest blessings. In that moment, under the vast canopy of the starlit sky, everyone present felt the unspoken promise. When you give what you have, no matter how small, God can make it more than enough. And in his presence, there is always plenty left over. A beautiful reminder that his love and grace know no bounds. Chapter 6: Jesus retreats to pray. As the last groups began to drift away, Jesus stood at the edge of the crowd, watching them go with a gentle smile. He saw their joy and their amazement, but he also sensed their deeper need, the unspoken longing that had drawn them to him in the first place. He had given them food for their bodies, but even more, he had given them a taste of the spiritual nourishment their souls craved. He knew that the miracle they had experienced today would be shared and retold throughout the villages, spreading hope and a newfound faith. The disciples, still carrying the empty baskets, gathered around Jesus, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. Peter spoke first, unable to contain his enthusiasm. "Master, did you see their faces?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. They couldn't believe it. "None of us could. You took that tiny meal and fed thousands. It was amazing." Jesus looked at Peter, his smile soft but knowing. "Yes," he said quietly, "but it wasn't just about the food, Peter. It was about the gift of faith the act of giving from the heart, even when it seems like so little. And it was about trusting in God's abundance, trusting that He can make the smallest offering into something more than enough. The disciples nodded, each taking a moment to reflect on the lesson they had witnessed. They had been concerned about the crowd's hunger, worried about how they would provide. But Jesus had shown them that true provision comes from God's hands. Even a small act of faith, like the boy's simple gift, could be transformed into a miracle. As the disciples continued to talk among themselves, sharing their own thoughts and reflections, Jesus quietly stepped back. He moved away from the group, slipping into the shadows as the sky darkened, stars beginning to dot the deepening blue. He needed a moment of solitude, a quiet place to pray and connect with his Father. He had poured out so much of himself today, teaching, healing, comforting, and feeding the people. And now he sought the gentle comfort of God's presence. Jesus walked up a small path, away from the crowd and the murmuring voices of his disciples. The hillside was serene in the twilight, the breeze rustling through the olive trees, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the sea beyond. The noise of the day faded, replaced by the soft symphony of nature, the chirping of crickets, the gentle sigh of the wind, and the distant song of night birds. It was a peaceful, sacred space, perfect for prayer. He found a quiet spot under an old olive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like open arms. Jesus knelt on the cool ground, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath, feeling the stillness settle around him. In this moment, it was just him and his Father, the creator of all, the source of every miracle, the one who gave him strength and guidance. He bowed his head, allowing his thoughts to drift upward, his heart opening in silent communion. Jesus spoke softly, his words carried away by the wind. He thanked his Father for the gift of the day, for the chance to teach and to show the people a glimpse of God's love and provision. He prayed for the crowd, for each person who had come seeking healing and hope. He asked for their hearts to be touched, for their faith to grow, and for them to understand the deeper message behind the miracle, that God's love is boundless, His grace endless, and His provision more than enough. He prayed for His disciples, too, knowing how much they still had to learn. He knew their hearts were sincere, their desire to follow Him genuine, but He also understood their struggles, their doubts, and their fears. He asked God to strengthen their faith, to help them see beyond the physical signs and miracles, and to trust fully in the divine plan. He knew they were growing, step by step, in their understanding of who He truly was, and he prayed for patience and wisdom as He guided them. In the stillness of the night, Jesus also found space to rest His own weary spirit. He had given so much of Himself, but here, in prayer, He found renewal. It was in these quiet moments alone with God that He drew His strength. He knew the path ahead would be filled with challenges, that there would be more crowds, more questions, and more needs to meet. But for now, He allowed Himself to simply be a son in the presence of His loving Father, finding comfort in the familiar embrace of prayer. The stars shone brightly above Him, like tiny lanterns scattered across the sky, and the moon bathed the hillside in its soft glow. Jesus remained there for a long time, his thoughts rising like incense, his heart aligned with the will of God. He knew that this moment of solitude was just as important as the miracles, just as vital as the teaching and the healing. It was here, in the quiet, that he found clarity and peace, a deep well of calm that would sustain him through the trials yet to come. Eventually, Jesus opened his eyes, lifting his gaze to the heavens. He took a deep breath, feeling the peace that only prayer could bring. He stood up slowly, stretching his arms and looking out over the hills that were now empty and still. The crowd had gone, but the memory of what had happened today lingered like a sweet fragrance. He knew that seeds of faith had been planted, seeds that would grow and bear fruit in the hearts of many. With a final glance at the sky, Jesus turned back toward the disciples. They had given him space, understanding his need for this quiet time alone. But now they were waiting for him, their faces illuminated by the moonlight, their expressions softened by the day's events. He walked back to them with a gentle smile, his steps light, his spirit refreshed. "We should find a place to rest for the night," he said softly. The disciples nodded, falling in step behind him, their hearts full from the day's experiences, their faith strengthened by what they had seen and heard. As they made their way down the hill, the peaceful sound of the night wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Jesus led the way, his calm presence a guiding light, a reminder that even in the busiest, most demanding moments, there is always time to pause, to pray, and to rest in God's love. And with that thought, the group slipped quietly into the darkness, ready to embrace whatever the new day would bring, confident in the knowledge that they were not alone. God was with them every step of the way. Chapter 7. Closing Reflection and Prayer. As the peaceful night continued to settle over the hills, the warmth of the day's events lingered in the hearts of all who had witnessed the miracle. It was more than just a feast of bread and fish. It was a moment of divine provision, a reminder of God's faithfulness. The people had come with hunger in their hearts, seeking not only food for their bodies but answers for their souls. And, in his graciousness, Jesus had given them both, abundantly and without hesitation. Reflecting on the story of the feeding of the 5,000, we are invited to consider the deeper themes that lie at the heart of this miracle. First, there is the theme of faith. Faith not just in what we can see, but in what we cannot yet see, in the promises that God holds for us even when we find ourselves with little. The small gift of 5 loaves and 2 fish, offered by a child, may have seemed insignificant, but in the hands of Jesus, it was enough to feed thousands. What a beautiful reminder that God does not ask us to bring what we believe is sufficient, but simply what we have to offer. It is in the giving, in the trusting, that we become participants in his great work of provision. The story also calls us to reflect on generosity. The boy who gave his simple meal showed an open heart, a willingness to share even when he could not see how it would make a difference. His actions reflect a deep understanding of the power of generosity, not just as an act of kindness, but as an invitation for God to do something extraordinary with our willingness. Just as the boy gave his small gift, we too are invited to offer what we have, whether it be our time, our resources, our love, into the hands of God, trusting that he will multiply it in ways we could never have imagined. And then, there is the powerful theme of God's provision. It is easy to look at our own resources, our time, our energy, our finances, and feel as though we are insufficient, as if what we have is not enough to meet the needs around us. But this miracle reminds us that God's abundance knows no limits. When we trust in his provision, we allow ourselves to be participants in something far greater than ourselves. We remember that God is the one who provides for all of our needs, whether great or small, and that in his hands, even the most humble offering becomes a source of great blessing. Now, as we bring this story to a close, let us reflect on the comfort and peace that this truth brings. Just as Jesus fed the 5,000, he continues to feed us, not just with physical sustenance, but with the nourishment of his love, his peace, and his presence. In a world where it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the burdens we carry, we are reminded that God is more than able to provide for every need, to multiply our small offerings, and to bring us peace in the midst of uncertainty. We need not worry or fret about what we lack because God's abundance is always greater than our limitations. In this quiet moment, let us take a deep breath and allow ourselves to rest in the assurance of God's care. Let go of the worries and anxieties that have built up throughout the day. Let go of the fear of not having enough, of not being enough. And instead, let us trust in God's abundant provision, knowing that he will supply what we need, when we need it, and in ways that will bless not just us, but those around us. A prayer of gratitude. Heavenly Father, we come before you today with hearts full of gratitude, recognizing the abundance of your love and provision. Thank you for the reminder that you are a God who sees our needs, who cares deeply for us, and who will always provide what we need in your perfect timing. Just as you fed the 5,000 with a small offering, you continue to multiply our efforts, our gifts, and our faith, using them for good in ways we may not always understand. We thank you, Lord, for the reminder that we are never alone, that you walk with us through every moment of our lives. Help us to trust you more, to offer what we have with a generous heart, and to rest in the knowledge that you will take our gifts and multiply them. Let us not be discouraged when we feel like what we have is too small, but help us remember that in your hands, there is always enough. We lift up those who are struggling right now, Lord, who are weary and hungry in spirit or body. We pray that they would feel your presence with them today, that they would know you are near, and that you are more than able to meet their needs. Please use us, as your hands and feet in this world, to share what we have and to bless others. As we prepare to rest, we ask for your peace to fill our hearts. Let the quiet assurance of your care wash over us, and may we rest deeply in the knowledge that you are with us, providing for us, and leading us each step of the way. We trust you, Lord, with our hearts, our lives, and our needs. And we thank you for the abundance of your love, which never runs out. In Jesus' name we pray, Amen. As we close our time together, let us remember that God's provision is not just a past miracle, but an ongoing reality. Every day, He provides for us, sustains us, and fills us with His love. There is no need too great, no request too small that is beyond His care. And just as Jesus shared a meal with the thousands, He continues to offer Himself to us, the bread of life, the living water that quenches our deepest thirst. In moments of scarcity or uncertainty, let us remember that we serve a God who has more than enough. His abundance is far beyond our understanding, and His love will never fail. Whatever challenges we face, we can rest in the assurance that God will provide what we need. All we need to do is trust, rest in His care, and offer what we have, knowing that He will take it and make it more than enough. May we all find peace in that truth and live our lives with hearts full of gratitude, generosity, and faith. And as we fall asleep tonight, may we rest deeply in the knowledge that God's abundant love is with us, now and always. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing to our channel to join our community and for more videos like this. Now I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you on the next video. May God bless you.